The notion.
Yes. Okay. So, hi everyone. Welcome to our fantasy roundtable, sponsored by the Cartoonist Cooperative. My name is Blue Delaquanti. I use they them pronouns. I'm going to be your moderator for today. This is a conversation moderated by me, where four members of the Cartoonist Co-op who specialize in fantasy comics will discuss their process and priorities in creating fantasy. For our purposes, fantasy is not limited to stories with magic or mythical creatures. More broadly, we're going to be describing stories where another world is different from our own in some fundamental ways. A broad definition, but I feel like that will cover everybody's work here pretty nicely. What I will have you all do next is I would like you all to introduce yourselves, and I'll call you off by name. Go ahead and share your name, your pronouns, if you'd like to share kind of where in the world you're based and what you are working on right now. Why don't we start with Brendan?
Oh boy. Okay. I'll just launch right into it. My name is Brendan. I use he, him pronouns. I am located in New England, in the United States, and I am currently working on a project called Marukiru Destroy the Moon, which has one published volume, with another one planned to come soon and updates quarterly in a digital capacity.
Thank you, Brendan. Evan, you want to go next?
Sure. Hello, my name's Evan Dom. He. I have been doing mostly web comics, fantasy, like long format fantasy adventure graphic novels for years. I recently finished Vatu, which was a 12-year like anthropological fantasy project. I'm working on for the past few months a catastrophically ambitious sort of post-apocalyptic fantasy graphic novel called Third Voice. I live in Queens, New York.
All right. How about you, Foxfire?
Hi, I'm CW Foxfire, or just Foxfire. I use they pronouns. I've been working on a project called Colliery for about 10 years now. It's got one core graphic novel and then a few smaller zines and anthologies, and animated short films kind of orbiting around that graphic novel. And it takes place in kind of a post-apocalyptic Earth with bug people. So kind of a mishmash of sci-fi and fantasy in there.
All right. And then we'll round it out with CS.
Hi, everybody. I'm CS Garcia Martinez. I'm originally from Monterrey, Mexico, but I currently live in Chicago. I'm My current project is called Malatuna When It Rains, and it's a graphic novel. It's a court intrigue set in sort of this like fictional 17th century province. I don't know where in the world. And yeah, that's what I'm here to be talking about.
All right. So I have a couple questions for y'all that are good starting off points, but if at any point you all in your discussion want to go off on a like related subject, please be my guest. I am very, very gently steering the ship, but you frankly will have more interesting things to say about this than me. I figure a place we can start is, would any of you like to share what aspects of your stories' worlds diverge from those of our everyday world? And what elements did you want to explore in your narrative?
I like to generally at least present the idea that it's all built from scratch. Obviously, that's an impossible thing to actually do, but I've gotten in the habit over the years of like designing characters without a necessarily like human starting point, and designing setting in such a way where anything that's not necessarily historical and believable can fit into it. um I think that allows me to have a certain like looseness towards it and work with different thematic and historical ideas in ways that are like automatically a little a little looser and more poetic and generalizable that I like. Um, for the current thing, I'm really focused on like different conceptions of history and like the place of uh, technology and warfare, I guess. And like it would be so much more complicated to try to do that in something that visibly fit into real world history, I think.
Does
I
anyone
can go next
go
if
for it?
anybody. Yeah. Um, so a lot like Evan, I really wanted a world that was distinctly not Earth, distinctly not ours. I kind of started as a Conan the Barbarian ripoff. So my least favorite thing about that setting is that it's supposed to be a prehistory. So I wanted to do something like that, but I wanted to make it alien and really diverge from our kind of understanding of what our world is. So it's a lot of it is kind of just maybe a Bronze Age Earth with the volume turned way up. The comic is about a woman who wants to blow up the moon. So one of the things that figures heavily in the comic is the moon itself, and it's enormous. I think if a moon of that size actually existed in the orbit of a planet, it'd probably tear it apart. But I'm not worried about that right now. I wanted, there's magical energies and there's things that we don't experience on our world. She's got 10-foot long hair, so I wanted there to be a consistent sustained wind that would always be whipping things like hair and cloaks in the background. So that's something I built into it. There's a mysterious war that happens in their prehistory, 1,000 years in the past that nobody exactly remembers the details of. But again, like Evan was talking about, kind of a vast diversity of sentient life forms, some humanish, human-like, but a lot others not so much. And one thing that I like, and I stole this from Dark Sun, there's very limited mammalian fauna. So you don't see a lot of squirrels, horses, deer, rabbits, bunnies. It's all insects and lizards. And I added robots because I thought it would be cool to have kind of an ancient history setting, but there's machine life forms that are definitely something that's not understood by most of the characters, but they are a part of everyday life, and it's not outlandish to see them walking around. So that's how I've diverged as much as I can and tried to make a really alien setting.
Yeah, I did the notion, and actually, Brandon, when I was reading, I read Marukuru, and when I was reading it, I was really struck by like sort of like this like Cuchulainn like aspect of it, like this like or like
Oh,
veil,
sure. Yeah.
like this like the fact of the magic and the narrative are kind of like the same thing in a certain way. It's very cool. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna be here defending the human characters, I guess, because I only work with humans. Um, and I don't know, the notion of divergence and the notions of familiarity are really interesting to me because at the end of the day, it's like familiar to whom, right? I mean, there's a like legacy of like like Orientalism exoticizing in fantasy universes and so like a lot of the times the idea is like, oh, I want to make this feel if it in quotes like exotic or whatever, and it's like, well, okay, but for whom, right? um and so that's something that's like always just in my mind. I'm interested in making a world that is recognizably not ours and recognizably not any particular historical civilization of our world either. um you know um but where the psychology of the characters is to a certain degree very mundane. And I'm interested in creating a world where you have people who think and operate like we would, right, in certain ways, but clearly with a history and clearly with baseline assumptions about what the world is, right? That diverge from our own because those are socially mediated. So we have some recurring characters who are very obsessed with this idea of um, either a religious or sort of like social scientific order, right? And that's something, of course, that in our world we have a lot of people who are obsessed with that. But I think the way that the characters in my world are obsessed with it is distinct because what they consider orderly is distinct from what we consider orderly, right? There's a character there who's like there's an accident that occurs where someone gets bitten by a snake, and she's like, no, this is an orderly event, which I think is something that to most of my audience will be like, that is absurd. So I'm interested in that sort of divergence. I'm interested in a divergence that is uh socially mediated, but also um yeah, I'm interested in a divergence that comes from the social world, right? That if you grow up expecting certain things, how does that make a character different in the world that I'm writing about from a character that would be, from our society? I'm sorry, I feel like I just said a bunch of nonsense. I hope that came across at least some of that.
Yeah. No,
Um,
you've got me a lot of fun ideas. I've been taking down notes and I've been keeping them in the tank because I definitely want to float
yeah.
back to a lot of these that y'all have said. Foxfire, you want to close us out?
Sure. One of the big themes in my story is kind of the inheritance of sin, the inheritance of trauma. And one of the ways I wanted to, firmly seat that in the story is not only with the characters' stories themselves, but also like the world as I built it. So in the story, it's post apocalyptic. Like the world ended and they're rebuilding it, right? And the way these bug people are rebuilding it is based on these old records they found from humans. So it starts off very familiar using these things that, are very recognizable to the reader. And then as they get into the story more, it starts to diverge more and more away from what's familiar into something new, into something interesting. And that kind of I did that very deliberately, not only in the story itself, where it starts off pretty, it starts off in a very normal city with very normal situations. And then as the stories go on, they become more and more fantastical, right? To kind of, with the intention of having the reader feel like, oh, I know what this is about, right? But then as the story goes on, they start questioning, like, oh, this is something bigger, right? There's ideas I didn't think about, right? And I feel like, starting with it's a pretty common fantasy trope to start, the story starts in a very common village or town or whatever, something very safe and familiar. And then as the character grows, their understanding of how weird the world is also grows, right? So that's something I'm trying to do with Colery more and more, to kind of tie along with the character's personal growth, because I think the idea of understanding more of the world can parallel really nicely with understanding more of ourselves and how weird we are actually, right? Because a lot of people like to pretend that they're normal all the time, and that's ridiculous. So
Not anybody in this room, I hope.
Something that you all touched on in some pretty, like, I think different ways for each of you is touching on that aspect of a fantasy story's setting, which is like, as you all mentioned, this is like one of the most beloved elements of a fantasy story. It is kind of the foundation for how a lot of fantasy stories, how it opens to the reader, and that's something that expands with the protagonist a lot of the times over the course of the scope of the story. And it seems like each of you are zooming in or focusing in on a particular, element of what distinguishes your settings, what interests you, like religion, like ecology and wildlife, language, history. Are there do any of you want to talk any more about, go into more detail about any of those elements of your settings?
I do want to say, I think I can segue this into that. Brendan, you were talking about how you were frustrated that the Conan stories, which I also have read a lot of and love, um, do this like weird. This is actually a long lost history of the real world thing. This like rationalization thing.
Mm.
I I also am frustrated by that, and I was always sort of like desperate for fantasy to like justify or rationalize itself less. And thinking about it over the years, I think that like that was the 30s before people were really
Hmm.
had built up in their heads and in the culture a sense of like what was possible with
Right.
respect to invented settings. So maybe that was like an almost necessary stopgap to make it, I don't know, to make it permissible or to make the suspension
No,
of belief possible.
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, even Tolkien and Lord of the Rings is supposed to be a prehistory,
Yeah.
and it definitely seems like it was that rationalization of the time where it's like almost like publishers were telling writers you
Yeah.
need to tie it to the real world
Yeah, either
somehow.
that or it has to be like a portal fantasy or something.
Right,
But
right.
I say that to say that like it's kind of miraculous the moment that we're at now in terms of like cultural literacy about this stuff, where there's just a lot more freedom to be inventive in different directions in a lot of different ways within pop
Mm.
cultural products. And it's exciting that, you know, an audience is willing to meet you there and understand what you're doing with it. Um, that doesn't answer the question, but
I
I
mean,
forgot where we were trying to go. So,
well, we can kind of like pivot from this. You've talked about like this idea of different ways in which you can stretch a story or push that idea of, you know, this is an element in which our world is different from the world of this fantasy. Like, CS had a really cool thing about. I would love to dig more into maybe the idea of like religion or, you know, social like stratification could be really interesting. Evan, I'm sure you could go off about like language too, but I'm curious if anyone else is like thinking about conlangs as part of their story, you know, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'll take the
I,
bait here.
I would also I'm gonna have the simplest answer to this question. So I
Oh,
want to get
please,
my two
please, please.
cents in.
No, that is better.
Yeah, because I feel like I can kick this off because I've got the most basic approach to this. You know, when we first started doing this and I was reading everybody's kind of input on, and I'm like, oh boy, I'm the magic sword goes burr guy in this group of fictional historians. And you know, I anchor my story really simply. It's a revenge story about a woman who has been done wrong by a religious cult and a megalomaniac, and she's trying to get revenge on this group. And that's kind of the anchor, really simple anchor that I think can hold a reader. And then the rest of it, I just try to go as nuts as I can and pull in all kinds of different crazy things to build this world. But keeping it kind of locked into this kind of objectively, I mean, at least as the way it's presented to the reader, not a whole lot of gray space in my brief, which is, you know, this evil religious leader who is oppressing a global population, and a global population that embraces that despite the fact that they're being exploited, and then a person who is trying to build a movement, whether she knows it or not, to oppose that, and then kind of going crazy outside of the bounds of that single through line. So I think that's probably all I have to say on that. And now I'll let the real academics here take over and tell us how it's done.
I mean, I make up a bunch of stuff too. Recently something I did was I've been, you know, I do like these clothing and textile patterns, and then recently something I did was I went past to the last two chapters I've done, and all the stuff that I made up then I assigned a meaning to now, right? So I have this like these 3 or 5 pages that are like, okay, this little thing that I drew looks kind of like a fish. So that's just fishes from now on, right? And so that's a way I think where you could sort of like make something up and then fill it in later. Uh, I and the topic of sort of like language, and you know society in general, everything social, but the language in particular. I don't know why I like to make up languages. It is some virus that I have had since I was a kid, and I tell people please don't. It is a too many stories have been overloaded by people spending hours and hours on end up making up little language, needing to get it all out there as I have. Um, it's it's interesting because I mean the reader is going to be reading this in the language that we're talking about right now is English, but of course it can be Spanish or Chinese or whatever. So there's a sort of idea that like, oh, if everything's so different about this world, and I'm gonna ramble a little bit, these people cut me off. Why is how do we all like how do we also make the language distinct, right? It's something that a lot of people sort of fret over. And it's, to be honest, a sort of focus that, again, despite the fact that I do conlang, I've never quite understood, because the dialogue proper of my story is how I speak, right? I mean, there's different degrees of formality or whatever, but sometimes I just talk like straight up, like, you know, like 20-year-old Americans, or I'm translating it to Spanish, 20-year-old Mexicans. And I think this might just be because I have a background in linguistics. My undergraduate degree was in linguistics, and I just see like all languages have the same expressive capacity, including including our own language, our modern day language. And if I were to try to write this in a way that sounds like the 17th century, I mean, what is that, like Shakespeare? I can't write that fluently, right? So sometimes I've gotten a little bit of like resistance or something, where it's like, oh, why do they sound so modern? And it's a question I don't quite know how to answer, because it's a question that I don't know where it comes from. Yeah, I think there's a way to create a feeling of this world is distinct, that can operate based on the assumptions that people make, and they can operate based on the sort of like things that they consider to be important. But the language itself is translated into what we think. And I'm curious about if other people don't believe this. Other people are like, no, I do not use any modern slang whatsoever. Because I'm very happy to hear that pushback. What is the sort of like pros and cons of just writing the way that we write versus, trying to write in something like more archaic or more formal? Because a lot of the times, it's like what we consider old timey is 19th century. It's not 15th century, it's not 16th century, it's Victorian. I don't know. Putting some thoughts out there.
I have a little to bounce off that, if we don't mind. I'm trying to be a lot more mindful about language in third voice, like the spoken English language of the characters in third voice than I have in the past. Like in the past, I've kind of defaulted to like a slightly uptight, highfalutin fantasy voice for a lot of my dialogue. But I'm with third voice, I'm intentionally, there's a lot of modern believable slang, but then there's some characters that talk in an ostentatious kind of like fantasy old-timey way. And I don't know, all this stuff is so like blurry and just to taste, but anything can be modulated to suggest a certain atmosphere to it, it's ridiculous to assume that like as some nerdy fantasy readers do, it's ridiculous to assume that any question of like historical accuracy should enter into it, because yes, you are translating it effectively into, the language of the reader. But like, I don't know, when it's done well, I think there is an elegance to making something that has the texture that a pop culturally literate audience will understand as being old timey or whatever. I always think about The Worm Ouroboros, this fantasy novel from like the 20s, which was a big inspiration on Tolkien. It's a just wild, stupid, overblown, adventure story, but it's written in the most beautiful and uncompromising and elaborate, but totally ahistorical, like middle English, and it gives it a real like texture that I think is valuable. But yeah, I don't know. It's just a textural taste problem.
There's a book that came out recently that I've been trying to rack my head. I forget the name, and but it's a similar thing where I read some of it. It's like, wow, this feels like an ahistorical Middle English, but it really works, right? Because it's really about the texture. I mean, I'm translating my own work into Spanish right now, and Spanish has a tu usted distinction, like a formality distinction in the second person, and I'm like, God, I wish I had this in English, because it gives the world a completely different texture.
You thou use you
thou to have a you thou distinction. I'm not gonna use you thou. I'm gonna get bullied.
Your mercy, vuestra merced, right?
Your mercy.
I like the way that Gene Wolfe works around this. If anybody's read the Solar Cycle or Book of the New Sun specifically, it's the pretext is that it is a manuscript that the author has been delivered to the author from the distant future, and it is the manuscript that you, the reader, are reading is the author's best effort at translating this future language. So the understanding is that it is not, the original text is not in English, but it is the author's best effort to communicate this plot to you in a way that you will understand. And completely the opposite of that, when I write for fantasy, I try to imagine that everything is being read by Aku from Samurai Jack. And I think that that gives it a kind of texture that is appropriate to my work.
The gravitas of the late Mako. Yeah, that's funny. Foxfire, for yours, since your story is kind of about a society, if I'm remembering right, if it's a society that's kind of sprung up from like a distant catastrophe, like how do
Yes.
you deal with that challenge?
Yeah, I put myself in a really interesting position therein because I think like what what Evan and Brendan were saying about there's this kind of implication in fantasy that what you're reading has been translated and also localized from the original story, right? So, we're getting like we're getting an adaptation of the story that gives us as close to the intended feelings of the story. Same with any other localized story. And with Colliery, since it's all these like real world people, but almost 1,000 years in the future from now, it gives me kind of a fun challenge to say, okay, what did language become? How did pop culture evolve? And something I've actually thought about. So in the story, this event destroys the Earth at a given point in time, and these bug people are hiding out in these shelters underground, and then slowly rebuilding society. And then 500 years later is when the story takes place. Now, uh, I kind of have it in my head that at some point in the last 100 years, they started cracking open these archives of human media and pop culture and stuff. And so I wrote into the story that there was kind of an older fashioned bug language that they were speaking, and then all these young people start speaking like 20th century Americans because they're consuming all this 20th century American media, and creating this. I've been working on this like this conlang of that's the pure bug language, right? This bug language that they made up themselves, and how older people speak it and they really look down on younger people who are all saying dude and all this American slang that the old people don't like. But it gives me a lot of really interesting opportunities to say like, okay, what cultures, how did cultures intersect in those 500 years, right? Like, what kind of languages evolved, which then started getting strongly influenced by uh, inserting actual pop culture media into it. Like I try to imagine like other fantasy stories, what would have happened if all of a sudden a bunch of American pop culture started getting inserted into the language, right? And it gives me lots of fun opportunities to explore and understand how language works and how there's an implication of localization in the story. And I don't know. I don't know if that made any sense.
No,
I
it
mean,
does.
also to
Mhm.
defamiliarize the pop culture to a certain degree, right? Like
Yeah,
it's something that the reader will be familiar with, but not in this context. And to a certain degree, like the reader sees something that is from their, like assuming if again, 21st century readers, American readers, um, um, something from their context that they're like, oh, but in this case, it feels alien to me, right? Which is interesting.
right.
I found that
Yeah,
interesting.
that's
Post-apocalyptic. Go ahead.
yeah, that's actually one of the like the key things about the story, going from familiar to unfamiliar. People going into the story will see, one of the main characters, Kareen, listening to music that they have, right? Kareen's listening to The Strokes and Justice and all these bands that we know about. We're like, oh, I know that band, right? And so at first I've had readers be like, oh, it's just like a parallel world, and then they find out that it's actually like supposed to be like the real world, but many, many years later. And that becomes really interesting to them. And then as the story moves the characters kind of away from this urban city center, you start getting into the actual strange world itself. And you're able to, I'm able to rely on familiar pop culture as kind of an island that, you know, the reader can meet me on. And then, you know, once they're there and they're like, oh, okay, I recognize this, then I can take them further away from what's familiar, and get into the strangeness of the weird world outside of this island of pop culture. And that gives me a lot of really fun opportunities.
That is a really cool mechanic. I love that idea.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Post-apocalyptic literature, I feel like, straddles the divide between science fiction and fantasy a lot of times, because I feel like there are a lot of stories that attempt this, like, this break that is so severe that the connection to the past, if there is any at all, is like obscured in like myth or legend or what have you. And so any connections that we can have, like I thought of two books that I feel like do this well. Like Ridley Walker does this, where the main connection is through like Punch and Judy puppet shows. That's like the one connection to, you know, things that us in the current world might recognize. There's another book that came out recently called The Past is Read by Catherine Valente, that is like very fantasy, like coded post-apocalypse. And there's a point where the main character stumbles across a Cheers DVD, and figuring out, like, parsing as a reader that she is watching Cheers is very striking in that way that Foxfire described, where, you know, it doesn't connect because you're so used to seeing things through her eyes. Yeah, I think that's really well done. I did want to jump. I've been moving some questions around because I feel like it's a little more organic to how we've been discussing them. We've talked about how things can be executed well when it comes to like thinking about how to connect, you know, real world things or to divide them into its own fantasy world, connecting research, thinking about languages. I should also say, when we talk about conlangs, we're talking about constructed languages. Do any of you have any strong opinions about what are some major challenges or obstacles that a fantasy author can run into? And when can research and world building work against you?
I have opinions.
Yes.
I always have opinions. You know, I think that I mentioned previously that my world and my comic kind of started off as a ripoff of Conan the Barbarian. As such, all those old 30s pulp fantasy novels are great. They're also really racist. And so if you're leaning on the trappings of the genre, you need to be constantly aware that you are potentially leaning on something very offensive. And you need to be very aware that you need to make adjustments to modernize the setting in a way that captures the spirit of what you want, that is also palatable and safe for consumption by a diverse group of readers. You can't go word for word from these old things and take things wholesale just because it's, you know, it wasn't right back then. It was just accepted. You know, it was acceptable at the time is not really an acceptable excuse. It was just as wrong then as it was now. It's just that people accepted it. And so you can't be like, oh, well, I want to be like it was in the 30s. That doesn't fly. So you have to make sure that you're not, I haven't really run into this much. I thought I did once when somebody came to me and told me that they thought they were afraid I was towing the line on a racial stereotype in my book. And I got very concerned and I asked them to explain it to me. And it ended up being not what I thought they were going to say, but it still got me to look very closely. And now I really examine everything that I do with an eye to that. And I'm thankful to people who come forward with their concerns on something like this, because, you know, we want our work to stand the test of time. And I don't want to be somebody who 50 years from now, they look back and say, oh, well, he was pretty good, but he had some really wrong-headed opinions that made it into the work. You know, I want to be aware of that. And I want to counterbalance that and counteract that. And I really want to create a fantasy story that carries all of the mystique and the intrigue and the inspiration that those old stories did, but is also modernized in such a way that everyone can appreciate it.
That's why it became, for that reason exactly, it became really important for me to kind of understand the core conceit of real world power imbalances, because when it's easy to just look at the how those power imbalances are expressed, but not critically understand where the power imbalances come from, and you get people like in Detroit Become Human, you got the androids quoting MLK in just the most like awkward, heavy-handed way possible. Like it was clear that, they didn't fully understand the power imbalances because they just like, used a civil rights slogan for a situation that it didn't really make sense with, and at the same time undermined the movement that they were trying to pay homage to, right? And there's something, in my fantasy development that I had to confront the fact that Tolkien was kind of racist, and sometimes, he didn't mean it, but like all the good guys are blonde, white, and tall, and all of the like humans that are bad are all described as being dark skinned, right? And it, it's like, oh, you could have made a fantasy world with anything in it, and you still made the white people good guys and the brown people bad guys, right? Like he didn't mean to be racist, but it was just like you know, this ingrained sensibility that came from, his British upbringing that he didn't critically examine, right? It's normal and natural to kind of bring in an innate sense of, of society and the world. We kind of unconsciously put in our idea of the world and the people in it whenever we write. Like that's just something that happens. And with Tolkien, he was bringing in all of these, pretty Eurocentric or Anglo-centric views of the world, right? He had, hobbits, kind of this analogy for, British people just minding their business, right? And then, tall elves as being like this, like the they kind of represent the pinnacle of civilization, right? These blonde, tall, white people, and then all of the bad guys, the bad humans, were all brown skinned, and he didn't mean anything by that. He was just kind of unconsciously inserting his Anglo-centric perspective of the world into the work. And that's why it's, really important to critically analyze our idea of the world and of power imbalances. And also, when someone reads our work, how are they going to see themselves reflected in it, right? And with fantasy, it becomes, when anything is possible, it becomes really easy to accidentally, insert our unconscious biases into it if we haven't examined them.
Mhm.
And that was actually one of the reasons I made the characters in my book bug people, because I was like, all right, what's a type of person that I think people will have the least like cognitive baggage when they see them, right? Like with animal characters especially, it's very, very common to be like, oh, they're a fox character, they're going to be sneaky, right? Or like, oh, they're an elephant, they're going to remember things, right? We have all these like associations, and people do that with other human beings a lot too, right? Um, and people don't really want to address that very much. So I kind of just like circumvented that and be like, all right, how can I get straight to the human issues in my fantasy story without people tripping over their cognitive baggage that they associate with a certain type of person, right? And it's cool because then I can reconstruct a real world power imbalance in this fantasy world, right? From the ground up, and make people be like, oh wow, the moths in this bug world are treated very poorly because of these reasons. And hopefully it can, help people to realize that there's underlying issues for, the racism and sexism and ableism and all sorts of power imbalances in the real world by focusing on, the root power imbalance instead of the effect of those power imbalances, I guess.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's oh no, go ahead.
Hopefully that made sense.
That makes sense. I think just generally a little I get hung up on like a slightly abstracted version of that point. I think like I think a lot of people making fantasy, there's this tendency towards like, I don't know, thinking too objectively, or like thinking that storytelling is meant to be journalistic, or thinking that we're not making ideological statements with everything that we say. In fantasy and like world building, I think that sort of emerges in this premise, which seems absolutely just like the way that everybody approaches world building to me. This premise that like if you're making a fantasy setting, you have to objectively nail down all of its components, and then you put the little characters in it and tell a story about them interacting with all the objective components of the world or whatever, which is just not how people live. Like CS, you keep talking about the socially constructed dimension. Like we engage with the world through society, right? We engage with our sense of what the world is through all the different perspectives around us on that world, you know. So it's frustrating to me the tendency, and I think this is to your question, Blue. I think this is like a it's a trap, you know. It's a bad it can be a counterproductive way to approach world building, I think, to think that it's all just a question of figuring out what's objectively there and losing sight of things like, you know, what is the narrative, what is the ideological perspective, what does the world look like to the people in the world, you know.
Have being too literal with it.
Yeah.
Hmm.
That's a little too abstract. I don't know how to say that exactly, but
when we were prepping for this discussion, I was talking about game mastering for tabletop RPGs, and I think this marries really well to what Evan's talking about. And a lot of people think that when you're GMing these games, you have planned for every eventuality and every possible choice that your players could make. Which, if you've ever run a game on a tabletop, you know that's just physically impossible to do. And so much of it is improv, and so much of it is figured out based on the way the characters interact with the world and the things that they're trying to achieve. And you need to give the illusion that you've planned out every eventuality and that you've planned out every possible outcome for every decision. But really, you just need to realistically realize the path that your characters walk through the world, and you can leave the rest to be implied. You know, your themes will carry your world, your characters will carry your world. And you can kind of figure things out as you go. And I believe this very strongly, because I could not write my world if I tried to figure out every objective truth like Evan was talking about.
yeah,
It's just not a realistic way to do it.
That is a part of what I'm saying. Yes, and I agree with you about that, absolutely. But it's not a question. I mean, what I was trying to focus on is that like there are no objective fucking things. You know, I mean, it's I don't know. I'm trying to be a little more like metatextual with third voice with this stuff. Like I'm doing this thing where there's these little like you know, old comic book style editor's notes everywhere. They're like, this is what this means. This is this objective fact about the setting, but they're breaking down immediately because there's no objectivity. And like, who am I?
I like the one where the editor doesn't know what I read all your comics before we did this. And there was one in third voice where there's an editor's note that's just like, I don't know what this means.
Or one where it's like, oh, this can't be translated in front of like a polite audience or something like that. That was a good one.
Yeah, that's so good.
And there's something I mean, you think you're getting abstract. I've been trying to figure out how to say this concretely. But yeah, I feel like there's a fear, like there's a sort of like control freakiness to an inventive world to a certain degree. And there's a fear of audience responses that I've identified sometimes in myself also when writing fantasy. That is so strange, because then why are we writing, right? Like this idea that, for example, like, okay, I'm working with something that is not I'm creating a new world, I'm making something fake, right? So the reader can abandon their prior conceptions or something, or say that I can create something sort of from the ground up or whatever. And I mean, we've spent a while talking about Tolkien's intended or not racism. I think the question of whether or not he meant to be racist is also beside the point, because it is a racist text, right? In many ways, it's also a great text that has been inspiring to many, many authors, including authors of color, but you know, it is a racist text. And I think like, oh, how can that response of a reader, right, is a communication with the text, right? And of course, nobody wants, I think that's where the control freakiness comes in. Nobody wants a reader to come in and have a negative, unintended response to the text, right? But to a certain extent, I think something that I've been considering with my own work also is you are going to have resonances with what people bring. And you're not going to be able to control those resonances because you're not everybody. You're not every reader, right? And so I think I've tried to approach in recent years my work with a certain degree of humility as one part of a two-way conversation, right? The second part of our conversation being the reader, right? How does this concretely, to bring it concrete, because I don't want to get too abstract here. How does it concretely affect the way I write? Is that a lot of the times I'm not interested in answering a question in a text. I'm interested in positing it, right? And of course, the questions that one chooses to posit, right? Like in my case, the story that I'm writing about, you know, we start with a tax collector getting shot. The basic question there is, you know, why? And I don't actually answer that in the text. I don't answer the why, I think fully. Is because I'm still figuring this out. I'm coming from a position of humility. I think the characters don't know the full answer, and I think the reader might not either. But at least in having read this book, there's a potential for that question to be developed, right? And I think that's a really valuable. And so I think like, you know, like that fear of resonances with something real, I think that's almost like, well, then why are we writing, right? For example, like Foxfire, like you said, like, oh, I write about bug people because people don't have assumption about bug people. And I was reading your work, I actually have a lot of assumptions about bug people, you know, like real world people having compared to cockroaches all the time, right? And so I read your work and I'm like, oh, this is an actual cockroach character that, you know, has like thoughts and feelings of some kind. And I'm like, that's interesting. That's a resonance that actually I found that was valuable to me, right? So I don't know. I'm saying like 5 different things here, but
No,
I don't know.
yeah,
I think resonance is important. I don't know.
yeah, no, that's really good. I mean, when you write, you kind of have to. I mean, the first time you publish something that people start reading, you're kind of confronted with the fact that you're just meeting them halfway, right? And they're taking it the rest of the way. You're kind of, you know, you set the story in motion and they carry it in and interpret it the way they want, and they take, you know, it seems like every single review I get on on the first Colery graphic novel is someone pointed out something different that stood out to them. And that's really cool because it's making me realize that, you know, people really, your audience really brings themselves into, you know, into your work. And I mean, I feel like fantasy does this in a way that is different than other fiction, because there's always this idea in fantasy that kind of anything is possible, right? And I feel like people kind of open up a little bit to what they, you know, what they let themselves take out of a story when it's fantasy, right? I just know that when I read something that's clearly like very rooted in reality, very realist, I don't feel like I get as much out of it, right? It always feels like I'm streamlined into one particular feeling I'm supposed to have. But in fantasy novels and fantasy stories, it always feels like, you know, what you personally get out of it is almost more important than what the writer was like intending with their work, I guess. Because I know, like, I can't help but have an intention with my work, for whatever reason. It's just something I can't seem to get over. But I'm always really inspired by what audiences get out of it, because it's always different than what I intended, and that's really cool.
There's a real layer of depth that gets added when readers engage with a work, especially the fantasy work. And, speaking from a personal standpoint, all I wanted to do was create a playground where somebody could get hit with a sword so hard that their body explodes for 3 pages. And the fact that anybody can read that and be intrigued by the world and want to know more details, we've already expanded the discussion far beyond, my own personal entertainment, which is how this started. And I just think that's fantastic, and I'm always really happy to be like, all right, yeah, let's dig into this now, and that guy will eventually get his head cut off, and it'll fly for a couple of 2-page spreads, but there's what I want to do as the writer and the artist, which is very base and very visceral, and then there's how people respond to that, and the themes that I then follow up on as a result. And yeah, it really is like CS was saying, like Foxfire was saying, and Evan, all of you. It's a conversation, it's a dialogue with the reader, no matter how it starts and kind of no matter what you're saying. So
that's a great jumping off point for our last big question, I think, before we wrap up. What can you accomplish by telling your story using the medium of comics as opposed to prose or some other medium? Brenda, you did mention a bit you could have a guy's head flying across a 2-page spread, which does feel like a pretty medium unique experience.
This was something I didn't understand when I was a kid. And I remember when the Watchmen movie came out and Alan Moore kind of I don't remember exactly what it was that he said, but I remember the gist of it because it stayed with me. And it was having to do with the medium of comics being uniquely able to pack information in a way that can be studied and returned to at the reader's pace. So you can create, it's like Where's Waldo, but with lore, an information dense page where the reader on a first viewing is not necessarily going to get everything, unless they sit there and study it for hours. Film moves at the filmmaker's pace. Even I feel like prose moves at the author's pace more than comics does. Comics really moves at the reader's pace. The amount of time that you want to spend looking at the images and reading the text, and how you appreciate all the way that those elements come together to tell a story. I think that's what makes comics unique and special, is it's something that can be curated in the best way by the person reading it. That's what I think of it, at least.
Prose is a one-dimensional line. I mean, you can do it like richly and draw attention to a lot of things at once in prose if you're writing carefully, but you can't have that like multiple focal points at the same time thing that lends itself, I think, extremely well to doing like densely invented setting type storytelling. That's always been kind of the main medium thing to me, but the stuff I'm hung up on lately is just like, this is a medium that allows me to do visual storytelling extremely cheaply, exactly how I want to do it myself, and allows me to like work with serialization in a way that is kind of unique and that I really love. Those are the big ones for me.
I have a very simple answer to this one. I got an asked to do this one before. It's like, why are you writing this as a comic instead of something else? Because I know how to do comics. I don't know how to do anything else. I can't write prose. I get horrible writer's block. I can only write dialogue, so I'm only able to write the stage plays and comics, and I don't have the money to put on stage plays. So comics it is, I guess. So I mean, there's a lot of benefits to them, and there's a lot I love in them. I think Evan actually brought up one of my favorite things about them, which is the fluidity of perspective, and the fluidity of time in comics. I think is really, really well, like everyone complains about flashbacks in TV shows and movies, but I think flashbacks in comics are all like, it's hard to mess that up just because of what Brendan was saying. You could reread stuff so easily, and time has a fluidity to it that's so like on your own pacing. But yeah, my simple answer is it's because it's what I know what to do, what I feel confident in, and what I love.
What Evan said about being able to have control over it was definitely a big factor. Being able to create interesting visuals efficiently was a big factor for me. But also, what Brendan said got me thinking about, world building. And I really like when I start doing my thumbnails for a comic, I do two read throughs of my own work. I pretend I'm someone who wants to read every single thing, right? And they look in the background for all the details, right? And uh, I try to imagine what they get out of that. And then I have a buddy who admittedly is like, oh yeah, I only read dialogue. If it's not dialogue, I don't read it, right? And I'm like, okay, weird, but okay. I'm going to pretend I'm him, and I'm going to read through and see if I still get the plot just reading dialogue, not looking at any of the background text, right? And it's really cool that comics can provide different experiences based on different readers' desires, what they want to get out of it, right? Like some people are really super into the world building, and I try to leave things for them to find that make the world seem richer for them. Comics can do that in a way that movies can't, right? You got very strict shot economy on movies. If it's not integral to the plot, it's cut, right? But comics, I can just I can have a page full of background text that, I can have a full newspaper that the reader could read through if they want to and get a whole bunch of background world building, or they don't have to and they can just, stick straight to the plot, and that's fine. And especially it becomes especially onerous in prose. If it's only text and you try to insert a bunch of world building, it like you get characters like expanding on the local history of something or other, and it's like, okay, this is a whole lot of detail. And some people are not as into it. But with comics, you can do that in a way that nothing else can, and that's awesome.
Absolutely. I think that would be a good spot for us to wrap up. Once again, let's have everyone share your name and where your work can be found online. I'll just go Brendan, Evan, Foxfire CS. Let's go down the line. Brendan, where can we find your work online?
So you said to repeat my name?
Yeah, please.
Okay, yeah. So my name is Brendan Albetsky, and I make the comic Maru Kiro Destroy the Moon. You can find all of my information, portfolio, contact info, and comic information on my website, brendanalbetsky.com. Maru Kiro, of course, is published in a single volume right now by Castaigne Publishing, which is available from my publisher. And you can also read the entirety of the comic for free in digital format on Global Comics, all accessible from my website, which is, again, brendanalbetsky.com.
Evan, want to go next?
Yeah, Evan Dom, DAHM. I am easy to find on the basis of that. The main thing I'm doing lately is third voice, stylized, I must insist, with the numeral 3. That's at rice-boy.com, and elsewhere it's easy to find. I have books out with First Second Books and Iron Circus Comics. Thank you.
Foxfire.
I'm CW Foxfire. You can find my work at coelary.com. That's COELARY.com. There's a few free comics on there, and you can also buy any of the books through there. Also, if you're in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of comic shops have my graphic novel, Coelary Blood and Beholden, and also my newest adult anthology zine called Mothboy Monthly, which is a magazine that would exist in Coelary. So if you lived in Coelary, you could find this magazine, which is pretty cool to me. But yeah.
All right. I'm CS Garcia Martinez. You can find me. I have a personal website at mckine.github.io. That's MAKKINE.github.io. I'm also on Twitter at smckine. So that's that's SMAKKINE at Twitter. I don't have much of everything I've talked about right here. If you try to find it online, you will not, because it is in progress. I'm about halfway, 144 pages out of 300. So if you are interested in getting a sneak peek, my email is on my website. You can email it to me, and I send it out all the time. But you will not find it online.
All right. And I am once again Blue Delaguanti. You can find my work online at blue, like the color DELLIQUANTI.com. It's not fantasy, but I did a comic for 8 years called Oh Human Star that you can read online as well. We are all members of the Cartoonist Cooperative or the Cartoonist Co-op. If you'd like to learn more about it, you can do so by going to cartoonist.coop. That's cartoonist.coop. We are doing all kinds of interesting projects, promoting a lot of really interesting work by members. Feel free to look that up and learn more. This will be available through the co-op in some form or fashion shortly. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining in on the conversation. That was a lot of fun, and have a good day.